Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to those who are joining. Thank you for coming to the lecture. So I'm Anna Pirani. I am a senior scientist at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, and I'm very happy to host you at this lecture. I'm here with Sohail Shaikh from also CMCC, and I will introduce the lecture, and then Sohail will moderate. In fact, it's he will discuss the discussion, and I will introduce and help moderate as well. So we're a very large group. It's lovely to see people are coming from all over, I think all over the world. So there's a very high interest, I think, on this topic. We have a fantastic speaker, Andy Reisinger, who will talk about what Overshoot is all about. Before I introduce Andy properly, I just give you a quick introduction to CMCC. The name in full is the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. And we're very happy to welcome you in case you haven't joined an event by us so far or not familiar with us. We're an international multidisciplinary research center, and we focus on studies that cut across climate science and the interactions with society in particular. So we develop models, and we go from the modeling and the sort of foundational understanding to applications at different scales, including a very localized scale, so bringing down this information into impact assessments, looking at economics of climate change and environmental change at the macro scale and micro scale with different methodologies. And we're interested in informing climate action and mitigation and adaptation, also in the context of sustainable development. We are structured around 3 research institutes within which the core of the research is undertaken by a series of divisions. We have one on Earth system predictions, and this is where our Earth system modeling capabilities are developed. We have projection and predictive tools that we implement from the global to the regional scales. And now we're exploring further machine learning and AI applications. Then we have an institute on climate change resilience. And this looks at different sectoral components, particularly the land use and forestry and agricultural dimensions, water and soil, and then bring all this through into frameworks of assessment of climate risk at different scales and complex risk, of course. And then we have the European Institute on Economics and the Environment, and this brings together a macroeconomic modeling team and a microeconomic modeling team, and this is where Sohail is actually from. Originally, I am based in the Institute for Climate Resilience. And then the organization has, since just over a year, instated cross-cutting strategic programs on new emerging and very policy relevant topics. Sohail is actually leading the one on integrating planetary biogeochemical industrial carbon cycle aspects, and I'm leading the one on predicting socio-economic outcomes in a changing climate. And with these programs, we try and leverage the knowledge that's built within these diverse multidisciplinary teams and digest and synthesize these out in a policy relevant manner. And then obviously we're pursuing the initiation of new novel research themes for CMCC's activities. And then finally, just to give you another highlight, we do have a high performance computing center. It's the most powerful computing facility in Italy. And we have 2 teams which are on the technical aspects of digital and data innovation, but also on the advanced training and education component in relation to climate change topics. So bringing out the knowledge from science research into more applied and greater understanding more broadly. So we've started this lecture series since a year, I suppose, just under a year. So I'd like to just share with you this format that we've initiated. It's a very high profile, important event that we hold semi-regularly. And here you can look back and see some other really interesting talks. And just to let you know that we have another upcoming lecture in October. And so just an invitation to keep following the news from CMCC and join these meetings, because I think they really are hitting some very topical discussion issues. Just a quick housekeeping. This is a webinar format, so unfortunately videos are all switched off and all that, but you can ask to intervene or just write your questions in the question and answer session, and you're welcome to do so during Andy's talk. And then with Sohail, we'll do our best to bring in your questions. And just to set up, introduce this particular lecture, Andy's going to be very much building, I think, on a key paper that we developed and was published earlier this year, which was all about trying to explain and build a common ground and understanding of what overshoot as a concept means. And so we as CMCC have, with our colleagues in the paper, developed a really nice resource which you can navigate and it's particularly find the key points, key takeaway messages from this paper, and also find out more about the visual information that's contained in this research piece. The point here was that we were taking stock of the understanding and assessment of overshoot in the last IPCC reports and the challenges that were at that level back in 2022-23 in integrating a sort of cross-cutting comprehensive assessment on this topic. There are knowledge gaps and literature is coming out at speed right now. But this paper was trying to, shall we say, put everything onto one page and give a sort of conceptual broad framework. And I wanted just to give a highlight that just in a week or so's time, we have a very important conference happening in Luxembourg that IASA is organizing. And I just wanted to let you know it may be too late to register. And yeah, I should have checked. I'm not sure if there is a possibility to join virtually, but it's really interesting to see the material that will come out of this conference. And you can see actually some really interesting podcasts that are being prepared on the key topics that the conference will address. So if you're interested in overshoot, I really recommend going to look at the conference webpage. So now it's really, really a pleasure for me to introduce Andy. He's a very good colleague and old friend. We've worked in the IPCC context together. Andy is extremely experienced in the international assessment context. He's led chapters in the IPCC, and in the last cycle, he was vice chair of Working Group 3 on mitigation. And this cycle now, starting the 7th report, he's also going to be, again, a lead author for Working Group 3. He's also a board member of the New Zealand Climate Change Commission, and it's a body that provides independent evidence-based advice to the New Zealand government on climate change issues. And generally, he describes himself as an independent consultant, active in mitigation modeling, looking at sustainable finance, development of climate standards, and providing advice broadly at the science policy interface. So with that, I stop sharing and I welcome Andy, and I look forward to the presentation and the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much, Anna, for the nice introduction and for the CMCC to host the lecture. But I'm very much hoping that it's not just a lecture, but actually the beginning of a important, even if at times uncomfortable conversation that we need to be having. Just to pick up on the point that Anna already made, I want to acknowledge that much of what I'll be talking about is building on the paper that we pulled together with a range of colleagues that have all had involvement in the last IPCC assessment. But as usual, needless to say, at some points I may be going beyond what's in the paper, and any errors of omission, bias, inclusion, emphasis are obviously mine. Briefly, what I want to cover during my talk is the question, will we exceed 1.5 degrees? How did we get there and what now? What are the conditions for a return to 1.5 degrees of global warming? What does this mean for risks under such overshoot scenarios? And what are the key challenges and choices that this world presents us with? So launching right into it, will we exceed 1.5 degrees? The short answer is yes. As you probably know, the world has already warmed by more than 1.5 degrees in the 2024 calendar year. But you also know that global warming is generally defined as the long-term average over several decades. So a single year above 1.5 degrees does not mean that we've reached global warming of 1.5 degrees. But there's also a challenge because global warming is a long-term average. So it's very hard to say what is the global warming right now if it's a long-term trend that has yet to play out in its fullness. There's a major community effort underway to come up with an established methodology for that. One way of thinking about that is simply to run a simple climate model that captures the key drivers of climate change, including obviously the emission of greenhouse gases by human activities, but that isn't affected by year-to-year short-term annual variability of the climate system. Based on that, what you can see as the black line is that we're currently not yet at 1.5 degrees. However, we will crash through that limit within the next 5 years or so. And by now, there's precious little we can do to prevent that from happening. So how did that happen and what now? It might be helpful to think about it as an analog. Back in 2015, when governments decided that they wished to pursue efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, the IPCC set to work and provided a comprehensive report that contained distance to various temperature goals or limits. It also provided a very clear exit signpost that said, if you want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, you need to take transformative action in all sectors, which means slow down, head for the exit. Governments, by and large, accepted the report, said thank you very much for this groundbreaking, really important report, and kept on driving. So as a consequence, if you right now look over your right shoulder, the thing that's just swished past was the exit, and we are not on it. However, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily stuck in this high-speed car chase. There's lots more exits coming up on our way, exits for 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 degrees, but because we're still driving at a fairly high speed, they're coming at a fairly fast pace, and the distance to target has been shrinking. So we're not stuck on the highway, but if in order to take any of those exits, we have to actually indicate, look over our shoulder, and for goodness sake, slow down in order to take those exits. Before I stretch that metaphor too far past breaking point, let me get back to climate science. So we will exceed 1.5 degrees of global warming within the next 5 years or so. Under current policies, the warming will simply continue to increase to somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees, if not more. However, there's lots of exits coming up. There is a cluster of exits that we have missed. By now, we are simply too far away from the emission reductions that would have been needed by now in order to limit warming at 1.5 degrees or close to it. And it's actually quite difficult to say, but the option to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, or including with a very limited overshoot, no longer exists. This option has closed now under our watch. However, there's all these other exits coming up, and they're coming up at a very fast pace. To understand the pace with which they're coming towards us, it's useful to look at the total emissions that stringent mitigation scenarios involve. In the last IPCC assessment, the most ambitious category of mitigation scenarios, the ones that assume global, ambitious, concerted action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, started in 2020. They still emit about 510 gigatons of CO2 between 2020 and the time when we reach globally net zero CO2 emissions, which is roughly when temperature would peak. Now you can compare that number with the remaining carbon budget, which is the total amount of CO2 emissions that humanity can still emit from a certain date onwards, taking into consideration the warming caused by non-CO2 gases, to limit warming at a certain level. From the 1st of January 2020, that amount was 500 gigatons, which is why the most ambitious IPCC mitigation scenarios were able to just about limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But time has passed, and our action has not been one of globally ambitiously coordinated mitigation actions. So now, from the 1st of January 2026, the latest assessment is that the remaining carbon budget for 1.6 degrees is 268 gigatons of CO2, less than even the most ambitious scenario in the most ambitious cluster of scenarios assessed by the IPCC. And even to limit warming to 1.7 degrees, the remaining carbon budget is about 448 gigatons of CO2, less than the median of the most ambitious scenarios. So one way of making sense of those numbers is a few rules of thumb. You can simply say that based on the IPCC assessment, reaching global net zero takes about 30 years of transformational global action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. During that time, global temperature will rise by at least another 0.2 degrees Celsius because we continue to emit CO2 until we reach net zero, and that adds to the already existing warming. And every 5-year delay before we start coordinated action adds another about 0.1 degrees Celsius to global warming. And as a consequence, by now, limiting warming to 1.7 degrees requires about the same transformational change that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees would have required in 2018 or 2020. So the urgency of action remains, even though we have just swished past the chance to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And you hear narratives by some sectors of business and some governments that say, well, 1.5 was always overly ambitious. Now it's time for more pragmatic and realistic policies. This is a grave mistake. We do not have time for pragmatism and realism if it means delay and slow walking climate action to keep the window open to at least take the next exits now that we've failed to reach the 1.5 exit. And keep in mind, of course, there is a reason why these exits matter. Not just every year, every ton of emission matters. Every 1/10 of a degree additional warming increases the risks that the world faces. Every 1/10 of a degree more leaves us in a more risky and more damaged world. That's illustrated here by the famous burning embers diagrams, which is a way of visually illustrating the amount of risks in key systems globally, unique and threatened systems, mainly ecosystems, the risk from extreme weather events, or the uneven distribution of impacts, which is in itself a key risk. And the more the colors go from yellow towards purple, the higher the risks are. So faced with that, we may well ask ourselves, is there any way back? Is it possible to stick with the driving analogy? Can we take the long way home, even while accepting that we will exceed 1.5 degrees of global warming in the near term? Can we bend the temperature curve back down again to go back and dial back some of those risks? And those blue pathways are, of course, what's known as overshoot pathways. They're pathways that first exceed a given limit of global warming and then decline back towards it, towards a specific warming level and within a specific time frame. And the most plausible one is before the end of the 21st century, because once you go beyond that, it's sort of an open-ended window that is potentially equal to never, never. It's probably important to recognize that overshoot in this scientific terminology is quite different from overshoot in common English. In common English, overshoot simply means missing your mark, exceeding what you set out to do. In scientific parlance, overshoot means to exceed and to decline back to below the limit that you set for yourself. There's two key characteristics in which we can describe overshoot scenarios, which is the magnitude of overshoot, by how much do we exceed 1.5 degrees, and the duration of overshoot, for how long will we exceed 1.5 degrees. And a key driver for those two characteristics is the pathway of global CO2 emissions. Global warming will peak roughly when we reach net zero CO2 emissions and will decline if we achieve globally net negative CO2 emissions. So the sooner we reach net zero CO2 emissions, the lower the peak of global warming will be, the lesser the magnitude of overshoot. The more we manage to achieve net negative CO2 emissions thereafter, the shorter the duration of overshoot. So that means there are two essential conditions for a return to 1.5 degrees. One is to limit the magnitude of overshoot, to peak global warming as close as still possible to 1.5 degrees, and we're moving further and further away from it with every year of delay. That means reaching global net zero CO2 emissions as soon as possible and reducing non-CO2 emissions as much as possible. The second condition is to limit the duration of overshoot, which means to reduce warming after the peak to or back below 1.5 degrees requires net negative CO2 emissions and further methane reductions. And I'll explore in a bit more detail what those conditions mean to actually achieve a decline in global temperature. But first, to limit peak warming is the preeminent immediate requirement. That means first and foremost to close the credibility gap in net zero climate targets. The world is awash with climate targets that have no plans, no policies, not even the concept of a plan for how to achieve them. Rather than walking back from such targets, leaning into them to ensure delivery of those targets is a crucial step to actually keep 1.5 within reach by limiting how much we exceed 1.5. In addition, of course, increasing the ambition of NDCs and of sectoral and domestic targets would further help limit by how far we will exceed 1.5 degrees. Reducing warming after the peak fundamentally relies on what we do with global CO2 emissions, because CO2 is globally the dominant driver of climate change. We know that global warming increases with the cumulative amount of CO2 emissions. The more CO2 we emit, the warmer the world gets. It will only stop warming once we reach globally net zero CO2 emissions, from which follows, to dial warming back, we have to achieve net negative CO2 emissions. We have to take more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we're still emitting at any point in time in future. A second option exists around, in particular, methane, where further reductions of methane would also help dial temperature back down again after the peak. And I'll explain in a bit more detail in a minute what that means. So what would those pathways that achieve an overshoot, i.e. a decline in temperature after a peak, actually look like? Let's start with a stabilization pathway that would exceed 1.5 degrees and then stabilizes temperature somewhere between 1.7 and 1.8 degrees. The global emissions that would relate to such a temperature pathway are given on the right, where you can see that we have gross CO2 emissions declining, but not necessarily declining to zero. They are counterbalanced by CO2 removals, commonly known or abbreviated as CDR, or gross carbon dioxide removal, which result in small net negative CO2 emissions shown by the dashed white line. And on top of that, you have non-CO2 emissions. Now, one option to achieve a temperature decline is to simply increase net negative CO2 emissions by massively upscaling the amount of CO2 we take out of the atmosphere. That's often what people think about when they think net negative CO2 emissions. It's to increase CDR to the point where it more than just counterbalances residual CO2 emissions, but we actively pump CO2 out of the atmosphere. However, that's only one way of achieving net negative CO2 emissions. Another way would be to focus much more on reducing the residual CO2 emissions, which would achieve the same amount of net negative CO2 emissions, with much less CO2 removal, simply by driving down the CO2 we still expect to emit. It's very hard to abate all CO2 emissions, but hard to abate is quite a flexible concept that's mutable by new technologies, but also by concerted action on the demand side. A third option is nothing to do with CO2 first and foremost. Of course, you still have to get to at least net zero CO2, but a strong focus on reducing non-CO2 emissions. And that's quite a sensitive dial, mainly in the form of methane emissions. You can barely see that the thin blue band, which symbolizes non-CO2 emissions, is a lot lower here. This pathway would also achieve a decline back to 1.5 degrees, even though it doesn't go very far into net negative CO2 territory. It would, however, require a substantial further reduction in methane emissions. Most economic models assume that we're left with somewhere between 200 and 170 megatons of methane by the year 2100. If hypothetically, through a combination of new technologies and demand-side changes, we could reduce those residual methane emissions down to 50 megatons, we would achieve a decline of almost 0.2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. So there's essentially three archetypes of how to achieve a temperature decline: upscaling of CDR, stringent reduction of gross residual CO2 emissions, and stringent reduction of residual methane emissions. In practice, of course, we would expect to deploy all three of those. Now, it's important to take a bit of a health check and remind ourselves just what scale is actually needed. Reducing temperature by about 0.1 degrees Celsius requires about 220 gigatons of cumulative net negative CO2 emissions. Keeping in mind, net negative means compensating not just for the residual CO2 emissions, but then going beyond that to achieve a net negative CO2 emission. For scale, currently, all around the world, adding up all the afforestation projects that are going on, currently we remove about 2 gigatons per year. So even if we manage to drop global CO2 emissions to zero, if we drop global deforestation to zero, it would take 100 years at current afforestation rates to bring down temperature by 0.1 degrees Celsius. For methane, every further 60 to 70 megaton reduction in methane emissions would achieve a decline of about 0.1 degrees Celsius. Currently, we're emitting about 400 megatons per year. Most economic models suggest that we can drop this by about half to 200 megatons by the middle of the century. So it would require a major effort to then eat into those hard to abate methane emissions, particularly from agriculture, to drive a further decline in temperature by 0.1 or 0.2 degrees Celsius. Keeping in mind, those reductions have to be in addition and go beyond what's needed already to stabilize global warming at a level below 2 degrees. None of those options are easy. All of them involve substantial challenges, but in principle, we know what's involved. Assuming we can achieve that, I want to briefly now reflect back on how much would this actually reduce risks associated with overshoot, and how much would a reduction in temperature dial back those risks. We know very robustly from the scientific literature that climate change risks increase with every fraction of global warming. What we don't know very well at all at this point is whether the risks actually decline proportionally if we were to decline global temperature again by the actions I've just outlined. That's a significant knowledge gap, and I want to elaborate a bit more what that involves. A return of global temperature does not equate a recovery, even just of biogeophysical Earth systems. Some of them we would expect would recover, possibly with a lag. As an example, Arctic sea ice loss we would assume would recover, maybe with a lag of a few decades, if temperature declines again. However, ecosystems, once they are disrupted beyond a certain threshold, once you've lost keystone species, once food webs are disrupted in a significant way, dialing back temperature will not bring those ecosystems back. Trivially, extinct species do not become unextinct because temperature goes back again. And as a third example, sea level rise will continue to increase even if we bring temperature back down to 1.5 degrees, albeit at a lesser rate than if temperature remains elevated well above 1.5 degrees. So even though reducing temperature would avoid some risks, it will not undo the increase in risk that happened in the meantime. And the social component of drivers of risk is also going to play a major role. And let me talk a little bit about what this means. So risk is fundamentally the product of four drivers when you think about climate-related risks. Climate-related hazards, the exposure and vulnerability to those hazards, but also the risk from response measures gone wrong, in the sense that most climate change responses aim to reduce climate hazards or exposure or vulnerability, but if done badly, they can also exacerbate them. So there's essentially four drivers of climate-related risk. Now, what might happen conceptually if the world undergoes an overshoot and then returns back to 1.5 degrees? And let me just illustrate this, as I say, conceptually, not in a concrete example, but just thinking through what this might mean for malnutrition and rural poverty due to increased drought risk. Let's assume there's the four drivers of risk that result in a certain risk level when 1.5 degrees is first exceeded. As temperature then increases and remains well above 1.5 degrees, most of those blades would be greater, and therefore the total risk would be greater. The hazard would be greater because there's a greater frequency and intensity of droughts. A greater area is affected, the exposure is greater, vulnerability is greater because malnutrition erodes not just the capacity of institutions to respond, it leads to a deeply embedded rural poverty, and malnutrition in itself is inheritable through the passing on of nutrition in the womb. So it's a multi-generational challenge that is compounding over time. Now, what would happen if we do manage to dial temperature back down to 1.5 degrees? One could assume that hazard would decrease somewhat, but not necessarily entirely, because land cover might have changed, soil erosion might have reduced soil water holding capacity. Equally, exposure might reduce, but not back to where it was previously, because a larger area still remains affected by the increased drought risk, by the increased soil degradation and land degradation. Crucially, vulnerability would remain likely much higher than it was when 1.5 degrees was first exceeded, because of the erosion of institutions to actually deal with the pressures from rural poverty and malnutrition, possible outmigration, and just systemic poverty. In addition, risks from response measures, for example, from the demand for biofuels, could increase further. As a result, a world that returns to 1.5 degrees would likely face materially higher risks than when it first exceeded 1.5 degrees, because of those factors that all contribute to risk being higher, even though temperature may well have returned to 1.5 degrees. Let me take another example that is a far more optimistic one. Let's consider mortality from heat waves. When temperature exceeds 1.5 degrees, obviously the hazard from heat waves increases, the exposure increases because more people are exposed to damaging heat waves. Let's assume hypothetically that vulnerability does not change over time. That's an optimistic assumption, but let's make it just as a conceptual example. What would happen if temperature comes back down again? We could optimistically assume that hazards and exposure would reduce because the frequency of heat waves goes back to what they were before 1.5 degrees. Now, if we implemented effective adaptation measures during the period of overshoot, we might have even reduced vulnerability due to more effective early warning system, upgraded building design, more effective cooling provisions, more effective provisions for tenants versus landlords in terms of access to cooling equipment. So in theory, you could end up optimistically with a lower risk after the period of overshoot if adaptation has been highly successful. And in our paper, we explore other scenarios of example risks, most of which end up with a world that remains materially more damaged after we return to 1.5 degrees than it was when we first exceeded 1.5 degrees. It very much depends on the context, the type of risk, and the local context, including how we respond to overshoot via mitigation and adaptation, that drives future risks if we were to return to 1.5 degrees. So that leaves us with a dichotomous interpretation of the benefits of reducing warming back to 1.5 degrees. On one hand, it's clear that a world that returns to 1.5 degrees after overshoot will be more vulnerable and more damaged than if we had never exceeded 1.5 degrees. Walking back to 1.5 degrees does not undo the damages that would have been caused during the overshoot period. However, in most instances, not in all, a return to 1.5 would reduce many risks and avoid future losses compared to if the world remains above 1.5 degrees permanently. So it depends what you have as a mental concept of what's the alternative now and what are we comparing ourselves against when we talk about the desirability and feasibility of reducing temperature back to 1.5 degrees. I just quickly want to close with some of the challenges that presents us with. On adaptation, I've already outlined the evolution of risk under overshoot depends very much on how society is able to adapt to the pressures to climate-related risks during the overshoot period. but we're facing massive adaptation gaps and finance gaps right now. Under Overshoot, there's a strong chance that there will be enhanced competition for climate finance and for policy attention if the world were to decide we do want to bring temperature back down to 1.5 degrees. That also creates a risk that there's a perception that adaptation is less critical, even though risks are increasing in the near term, because we now will undo the damages from climate change by bringing temperature back down to 1.5 degrees. So there's a risk of underinvestment if we were to rely on temperature not exceeding all that far or coming back in a hurry to 1.5 degrees. A real tension for decision makers concerned with adaptation. And there's a high potential for highly inequitable outcomes where those with the access to the most effective adaptation measures would benefit most from a return of temperature, whereas those with least access in the near term to adaptation would also benefit least from a return of temperature because the lasting vulnerability scars remain even if temperature comes back down to 1.5 degrees. So adaptation remains a critical component of overshoot strategies if they are to be beneficial for a wide range of society. On mitigation, in order to reduce global warming, we have to actually decide that we want to achieve this. Paris Article 1, which provides for global net zero greenhouse gas emissions, would achieve a small decline in temperature, but it wouldn't get us very far if the overshoot is more than just tiny amount above 1.5 degrees. Will there be a global consensus that we actually want to achieve this? If there is, it will put global burden sharing discussions on steroids. Who should lead? Who's responsible? Who needs to pay? Who needs to provide the resources for achieving a temperature decline via CDR, via investment in new technologies, via managing demand side measures that achieve a decline in temperature? It also therefore means we have to go beyond net zero. Net zero right now is often seen as the be-all and end-all of climate policy. However, to achieve a decline in temperature, it can only be a milestone on a journey towards net negative. So frontrunner countries and corporates, or those who would like to be thought of as frontrunners, need to start developing net negative targets and develop credible pathways for delivery of net negative targets by 2050 if we want to keep a return to 1.5 degrees within reach. It also means we have to go beyond polluter pays principles to design policies. A key example are emission trading schemes. We do not know how to effectively operate emission trading schemes with a net negative cap. At best, we can envisage a net zero cap, which also means achieving net negative emissions will redefine the role of governments as key actors in delivering emission outcomes rather than just as regulators of markets, which in turn relies on a societal consensus to drive towards net negative emissions rather than just counterbalance remaining emissions to achieve net zero, which increases challenges to deciding on effective domestic and sectoral burden sharing schemes. So to close off, what will it take to keep 1.5 alive now that we're about to shoot past it? To start with, it's the recognition that 1.5 degrees has enduring relevance beyond hindsight and grief, even though, and it's important to acknowledge, there is hindsight and grief. The grief is real, the grief is essential, but it has enduring meaning, not just because of what the International Court of Justice has found in its advisory opinion, because we know how to get back to 1.5 degrees in principle by limiting peak warming and by preparing to reduce warming after the peak. However, that requires us in the research community to develop an actual value proposition. How big are the risks avoided if we manage to return warming to 1.5 degrees? Who benefits and what actions are needed in the near term to ensure an equitable distribution of those benefits? It requires the setting of pathways, targets, and development of policy tools to achieve sustained net negative emissions at increasing scales. We need to be very hesitant to develop overconfidence in overshoot. Even while making clear that this is possible, we cannot rely on it and it will not be easy. Striking a balance here for a constructive conversation going forward will be essential. And as I said before, embedding adaptation in the overall strategy will be essential to ensure benefits. In closing, maybe the most effective thing that we all can do right now is to actually engage in a conversation about this. It's an uncomfortable conversation, a challenging one, but we need to start talking about it. Quoting Catherine Hayhoe, who often says the most important thing we can do about climate change is to talk about it. The most important thing we can do about Overshoot is talk about it. So leave it at that and just remind you again of the Overshoot conference that's coming up, which is hopefully another starting point for an enduring conversation. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. Great presentation, very inspiring, despite the message that overall it's showing the heightening risk in climate change impacts. So I'm gonna start the conversation, and what I would like to ask also the audience is please use the Q&A part of the platform to post your question. I already see that some of you have started posting questions. Please keep them coming. I will try to summarize some of them. And while we are talking, maybe Andy also can take on some of them, typing in some of the answers. But anyway, so I will start from the area that I'm more familiar and involved with, which is the carbon dioxide removal. It's one of the, as Andy talked, one of the options here we have, one of the three levers that Andy mentioned during that presentation with the graphs. So you have non-CO2 emissions reduction, then you have CO2 reductions, and then at the top of that, you have basically carbon dioxide removals. And we had a great question also in the chat, in the Q&A, about what are the CDR options and what are the viable options. So that is, of course, also a million-dollar question. If we knew which one is gonna work, definitely there will be lots of interest in investing in one of them. But I wanna say, we are in a position that we see a divergence, still a diverging portfolio of CDR options, which is not necessarily bad, but I think it is necessary to get us to the level that the market needs are answered through CDR, because we know that not any single CDR technology and option will provide necessarily reduction that we need in terms of carbon removal. And he talked about gigaton scale. And we know from all the technologies that so far we have seen, none of them can meet all the requirements for the CDR. I mean, cumulative reduction that we need. Some of these CDR options are limited by the necessary materials that they are using, or for example, land availability, some of the land-based CDR. Some of them have consequences for the ecosystem and environment, for example, biodiversity and nutrition, food security in some of, again, land-based CDR is being affected. And some of them, we are not sure how to scale them up yet. We have tested them in a smaller scale, but we don't know how to scale them up into the gigaton scale. Do we have enough infrastructure and all the pipelines to deliver the captured carbon and store it safely? The storage is another big topic here. Can we make sure that the storage is durable and long-term storage is guaranteed? Do we have enough space for storage and where they are located? So there are active areas of research and papers coming out looking at these issues. But I want to also highlight, beside these diverse technologies, that we see a very dynamic market in terms of technologies, CDR technologies are emerging. Beside that, what we really need is the market, a demand side. What this carbon, who should pay for this carbon which is captured and stored? Because we know that so far the governments and some of the governments and basically, for example, European Union or some of the advanced economies are paying for this kind of testing these technologies in a limited scale. But if we want to go to the gigaton scale, this requires massive investment, a massive investment for not only reducing carbon, but removing carbon and storing it. So how we can create the demand side, a stable demand for removing carbon and a market for that. And this, both sides require stable policies and policy commitments, something that unfortunately we don't see yet happening at the global scale. As you can see, in major emitter countries like the US, we have always this shift in policies every 4 to 8 years. We see by geopolitical changes, the government also changes this policy toward climate. And that has subsequent impacts on the businesses who are getting into carbon dioxide removal. So overall, I would say we need technology, basically diversification that we can see it is happening. We need policy commitment, and we need demand side stability to have a market condition for these technologies to grow. And then the financial side, of course, the investment, we need a stable flow of investment into these technologies, and looking beyond subsidizing this technology, looking into how these technologies can survive without subsidies, and looking into moving to the project finance, how these technologies can create revenue stream that compensate the cost for them. So CDR field is growing, and it is an exciting field both for research and investment so far. There are lots of obstacles, both internationally coordination, regulations are fragmented in different parts of the world. And as I said, still the financing streams are not stable flowing into this market. But I think this is one of those levers that can get us back to 1.5 degrees after the overshoot. The other lever, of course, is the reducing emissions. And for that, I wanted to say, we can see that it is happening. The good signs we can see are happening around the world. We see that renewable energy, renewable electricity especially, is picking up now in lots part of the world. We can see that the price of electricity generated by renewable energies like solar is even below the traditional fossil fuel sources of energy. So that is a very good sign, showing that these energy sources are not compatible and competitive. The second part is about nuclear that I want to highlight. The rise of AI especially has forced many countries to revisit their policies toward nuclear. Nuclear of course, has these issues with the safety and regulations, and we should be all aware of all those constraints that we have. But nuclear can provide a very stable, clean energy in long term. That is what we need, and currently, for example, solar and wind and other intermittent renewable energies are not providing that. So revisiting nuclear energy, as we can see it happening in many developed economies, that's a good sign that it helps us to get to the second level, reducing the emissions. And also we can see that carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilization, those technologies are acting as a bridge to get us to CDR. If you are exploring those technologies, inevitably you are looking at the storage sites and building capacity for infrastructure and capacity for transporting carbon and storing carbon. So those are also needed for CDR technologies. And then we get to the first level, which is non-CO2 emissions. And I think Andy is again an expert in that. So I wanted to get back to Andy. Maybe you can say a few more words about methane emissions and the reduction of methane emission necessary to get to 1.5 degree again. Also, we had a comment, so maybe I just add this also. A question was from the audience about the, for example, tipping point that we may observe by permafrost thawing and the release of methane. And how can we make sure that we have enough capacity to reduce this methane?
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, I can see there's lots of questions popping up, and we're not going to get through all of them, but I assume that we can answer those questions after the hour closes. So I'll do my best to get back to people. I mean, I'm not the expert on many things, and in many instances, you are a greater expert on the issue at hand than I am. But I definitely don't want to leave anybody in the lurch. So I'll do my best to respond in writing to the various questions that we won't be able to address. But on methane, a couple of things. One is, of course, that it's quite easy to abate methane from fossil fuel use, largely around leakage. We know how to do this, and it's not expensive, which means that we generally assume that most of those emissions would already be avoided by the time we reach 2050 if the world actually takes serious collective action on climate change, which means that by that stage, we're left with the much harder to abate emissions of methane, largely from agriculture, or the very, very hard to abate leftover emissions from fossil fuel use, but also biomass burning, etc. So that will present significant challenges how to achieve even greater scale reductions of especially agricultural methane emissions. There is promising development of new technologies underway, but the question of how this can be upscaled and distributed into the global south, where there's lots of smallholder systems, different markets, there's not large industrial production systems of agriculture, that's a major challenge, which is why this is not easy. But it's important to keep in mind that there is in principle a large amount of methane that if we could develop solutions for it, then this would provide another lever to bring temperature back down again. And it's just, from my perspective, it's striking how readily in global economic integrated assessment models, we talk about gigaton scale carbon dioxide removal with technologies that have yet to come on stream, but we don't talk about the technologies that have yet to come on stream on agriculture that could also achieve major emission reductions. So we have to be very conscious of the narrative making element of global scenarios and what pathways they open up and what focus they provide. On the question of permafrost, methane emissions have increased rapidly over the last few years, much higher than they have in the past. There's been a number of studies, some of which point to the likelihood of tropical wetlands being the main source of that, but it's not a unique fingerprint. So yes, there is a chance that global Earth system feedbacks will make our job even harder. But at this point, we don't expect there to be a runaway effect that will make a rapid reduction of methane emissions from our side, from the human emissions side, moot or impossible. But it means it's even more urgent to make sure that we bring our contribution to the global methane cycle under control in case some natural sources increase a bit more rapidly than we would have expected based on our current understanding.
Thanks, Andy. Also, there was a question about, can we prioritize any of these three levers that you mentioned? Do you have any recommendation on if the governments wants to allocate, let's say, their resources, which ways to go first?
I think that's very much a region country specific question, because different countries will have different opportunities. Some with large geological storage potential are an obvious candidate to support geological carbon storage, part of the CDR side. Every country, every company can look at what they like to call hard to abate emissions, raise an eyebrow and say, really? Hard to abate? Is that really the case? Can't we do more about it? Which also implies not resting on a net zero laurel, but saying if we can go further, we must go further. Otherwise, 1.5 is definitely out of reach. On methane, some countries with high agricultural emissions, in theory, have the potential to reduce those emissions, but whether they actually can depends very much on their socioeconomic context, the development of technologies, but also development of global demand. If we have unfettered growth globally of demand for livestock products, it will be much harder or next to impossible to achieve the very deep reductions, whereas a combination of demand-side measures with new technologies could achieve much deeper reductions. So it's the usual all of the above at once, but the balance will depend on regional, national, sector-specific context, all of which will rely on the further development of both policy mechanisms, as you talked about, Sohail, and technologies that actually make things cheaper and less risky, because all of those carry substantial risks of mal-mitigation in the sense of serious repercussions for some vulnerable populations, of mitigation being driven too hard, too far in the wrong direction, and therefore leading to negative consequences. We often talk about this for CDR, but let's make no mistake, radical reductions of residual CO2 emissions equally have the potential to cause harm if not done well. So doing all of the three of pathways with determination and well is the challenge that we face for the rest of the century.
Yeah, great. And this emphasis on the regional options, I agree with that assessment. And I think we had very great questions also in the chat about, for example, in Africa, what are the options for countries in sub-Saharan Africa with limited resources that they have? And I want to combine it with another question, which is about the role of cities, especially because IPCC has emphasized on that, and that there is a special report coming on cities. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the role of cities and urban area in achieving the reductions necessary?
Yeah, maybe to start with the question about sub-Saharan Africa, it's one of those areas where, of course, not everybody has the same capacity and responsibility to achieve the deep reductions and net negative emissions. It is a global collective action problem. What we will face in future is that some regions may have high potential to help deliver net negative emissions, but we should never confuse the locus of abatement or the locus where net negative emissions are achieved with a responsibility of making those net negative emissions happen. So that's what I mentioned before. That raises questions about burden sharing. How can we achieve global net negative emissions while paying acute attention to equity and protecting vulnerable populations and ensuring that we don't jeopardize food security in the process? That will be an ongoing tension. There's no simple recipe for that. But it is a question about enabling actions to happen where they can happen without assuming that that also is the responsibility of the people living there to make them happen. That's where climate finance and global burden sharing comes in. On cities, the short answer is I'm not an expert on this. It should also be the long answer. I would just add that cities are an area where demand side changes might potentially offer the very large reductions in reductions of gross CO2 emissions. That's in terms of energy demand, demand for transport, passive houses that minimize energy demand, but also cities are the locus of much industry. So how cities organize themselves around providing energy services to industries, they're also the hub for global demand for products. And ultimately, deep emission reductions are only possible by achieving deep reductions in demand where that's feasible. But I'll leave it at that. And all I can say is I look forward to reading the cities report as much as everybody else on this chat, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you. Anna, please.
Yeah, so Sohail, if I can jump in. I mean, we're rapidly running out of time, so we just have a couple of minutes left. I think we can, if Andy agrees, assemble all the questions that were submitted and try and produce a sort of a general response. I'm not putting too much burden on Andy, of course. but it's clear from the questions we haven't been able to address all of them. And I was interested to see the moving from sort of the global mitigation pathway orientation towards a more regional conversation, and how all the questions that are coming in the chat are very much related to, so what are contextualized by, I think, where people are coming from, what these options are. Is one lever being prioritized or promoted more than others? But I think the point here is it's always an approach of a multitude of options. And as Andy said, it really depends on what is possible in different contexts. What we didn't address much was the risk dimension and the adaptation implications. I think the question about what we know about risk in cities, what we know, what risk should we expect in overshoot pathways, how are we supposed to consider the adaptation pathways in those contexts, potential tipping points. I think at this point, and Andy, I'd leave the last word to you, but I think it's a really critical part of this conversation that we need to initiate. And this is what we try and do with these exchanges. It's an area of, I would say, knowledge gaps are evident here. And so even the research questions and how to approach them from a methodological approach, from a modeling approach, it's something that really needs to be discussed at length. And so I just, maybe we will need to conclude now, unfortunately, but maybe Andy, I leave you the last word on sort of future directions of this conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I mean, as you say, it is the beginning of a conversation. There are large knowledge gaps, which doesn't by all means imply that we don't know in which direction to act. The imperative to increase upscale adaptation, to accelerate mitigation in every direction, that is enduring. We know far too much already to not do it. On the question of the evolution of risks, I think that's exactly where adaptation researchers just have to think through it. We have typically only thought about risk as an increase as a result of increasing climate hazards. Let's think through a scenario where the world takes hypothetical action, and let's think how those propeller blades might actually change over time. That requires contextualized, specific case studies to really work it through. And I mean, I'm always a great fan of don't be afraid of coming up with a conceptual story in order to think through what might this be, so you know what questions to ask of an actual case study and what actions would most facilitate a return of the propeller blades to the smallest possible level if and when temperature comes back down again, without sadly being able to trust that they will, because we had the chance to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we didn't take it. We have the chance to bring global warming back to 1.5 degrees. It's up to us whether we will take it.
Yeah,
I should probably leave it there.
Yeah, thank you for those sort of closing remarks. And it's clear also from comments in the chat that the involvement of perspectives from all over the world are needed in that conversation. So we look forward, I think, to the stimulating work that will come out now in the next years, because we have the new IPCC assessment report getting underway. There were questions about what the implications are for the Paris Agreement and the negotiations, but I think first and foremost, it's a question of research, of new findings, and the assessment that the IPCC will undertake in the coming years. And so, Andy, you'll be part of that, and so actually will Sohail. I'll be there as well. Many of you on this call, in fact. So I think we're going to be working very, very hard to provide the policymakers more clarity and more understanding of these issues. So thank you. Thanks, Sohail. Thank you very much, Andy. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.